everybody from all over the world who are joining us here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Shamila Subramani, and I am the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, all the way in South Africa. It's a pleasure to be here today, and also to share with you some discussions and a panel on impact investing, obviously a topic that's become quite hot around the world, but also something that has, usually around it a little bit of a shroud of uncertainty as to what impact investing is and where it fits into the general spectrum of investing that we've come to see now. And as we're seeing all things sustainability and ESG grow in prominence around the world, this is clearly an area that is, in many instances, started to be the next level of what we need to look at to really try to understand how we're impacting sustainable development in all of our efforts in the broad banner of responsible investing. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome today our two esteemed panelists who are joining us from different parts of the world. And a very warm welcome to Eli Kun, who is Impact Investing Fund Manager at UBP. Eli, absolute pleasure to have you here with us today and very much looking forward to your insights. And then Dr. Aaron Yoon from Northwestern University at the Kellogg School of Management, who is an assistant professor at that school and also done a number of articles and worked with a number of fund managers in looking at the broader space of sustainability and sustainable investing. So we have a limited amount of time today. I think we just have just over half an hour together on this broad, interesting topic that can go into a fair amount of detail and depth. So what I want to do is go straight into the discussion. And I'm going to start with you, Eli. We're seeing a lot of regional differences develop just broadly in the sustainability landscape, differences in thinking, differences in approaches, and of course, jurisdictions that are more advanced than other jurisdictions and where sustainability sometimes means different things. But let's take it back a little bit. What is impact investing and what is it not? And I would be very keen to hear your views on this. And what we want to do is also perhaps an add-on question to that we'll get to straight after that is that how is this different from the rapidly growing ESG investing that we're seeing globally, where we're seeing literally billions of dollars pouring into different types of investment with an ESG tag. So let me leave it at that, Eli, and hand over to you to help us with what is impact investing and what is it not from your perspective.
Thank you, Shamila, and thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be here. So what's impact investing? There's a generally agreed upon definition of impact investing as investment with the intention of generating measurable positive impact alongside financial returns. Now, there are two keys in that definition. One is that it has to be measurable. So it's not enough to say, okay, we want to invest in companies doing good. It really needs, you need to have KPIs, performance indicators that you can measure that are targeting the specific impact area, whether that be renewable energy or healthcare or education, whatever it is, it has to be measurable. The second key aspect of the definition is financial returns. And that is what makes impact investing different than charity, for example. It's not about giving money away. It's not about trying to do good and leaving returns aside. It's a definitive part of impact investing to generate financial returns that are adequate with the level of risk taken. And I emphasize that because we believe impact investing can never achieve the scale it needs to achieve just on the goodwill of people. It has to offer an acceptable return to participants in order to be able to reach the scale. And when we talk about the scale that impact investing requires to bring solutions to the problems we're talking about, we're really talking about trillions. It's not billions or hundreds of billions, it's trillions of dollars that we need to invest. And that amount will never be achievable just as part of a charity. Now, the second part of your question, what is the difference between impact investing and ESG investing? And the answer to that is ESG is primarily about how companies do things, whereas impact investing is primarily about what they do. And the best example that I can give on this is you can have great ESG companies that are producing cigarettes. You know, if a cigarette company is trying to minimize its environmental impact, if it's got a good governance structure, if it's treating its people well and having a diverse workforce and everything, then it can end up having quite a good ESG scores. And in fact, that is really the case. A lot of cigarette producers end up with good ESG scores, but it can never be an impact company. It can never be a positive impact company because at the end of the day, the product it produces is harmful to human health. So an ESG fund could invest in a tobacco company, but a positive impact fund would never invest in a tobacco company, because even though a positive impact fund is also interested about how companies do things, it's primarily interested in whether the product itself is positive impact or not.
Ina, thank you. I think in that short sort of set of opening remarks, you have really helped clarify and set the stage for a number of different areas. So I just want to recap very quickly on talking about measurable, on talking about financial returns. And so what you've also done is help us understand or sort of get past this myth that somehow impact investing actually means lesser financial returns or no financial returns, and also that it's not charity and it's not corporate social investment in the typical lenses that we tend to think about these things. You've also given us a very helpful segue, I think, into the question that I want to pose to Aaron. So, Aaron, when we think about materiality and measurement, that is the next level, right? So Eli set the context for us about how important it is about the what you do and not so much the how you do it, and that, you know, you can be doing really bad things really nicely and be considered good, but that's not what we're talking about. So when we move to materiality and measurement, where does that intersect with your world and the work that you're doing and what you're seeing in this broader context of sustainable investment?
So thanks for your question, Shamila, and really insightful context from Eli, because I'm still learning about what impact investing is. So I think it's probably pertinent for me to focus on ESG investing rather than impact investing, because ESG investing is sort of where my expertise, or, you know, what I've been spending a lot of time in. So our sort of so my view is that I'm trying to take this ESG investing activity from a firm, from an issuer, as given. And my research is about how to quantify that, because you know the debate as to whether ESG investment is value destroying or not, right? And my research agenda has been sort of to fight that uphill battle in the sense that ESG investments should be no different from, you know, typical investments that firms make, like R&D and CapEx. But the key difference is that ESG investments are non-financial information in nature, so it's very difficult to quantify these things, right? But if we have a buy-in that these are investment activities that firms are engaging in, there has to be an outcome, right? Dollars of outcome somehow, and there's got to be a cross-sectional variation across different firms. And effectively, you know, it is sort of that link between shareholder value and ESG investments that I'm interested in uncovering. And I believe that, at least in the States, there's a lot of asset managers who are interested in uncovering that process, right? So.
Thank you so much, Aaron. So that's also a very useful reflection for us when you talked about the US. And so one of the things that we're seeing developing in this broader context, or has been evident now for a number of years, when we're looking at the collective kind of term of responsible investment and where we're seeing a lot of that having happen. And of course, we know that the EU, for example, is leading in that regard. Eli, can I ask you to reflect a little bit on the regional differences and approaches, and sort of where the thinking is at in the EU, and maybe your reflection, that versus other economies or other jurisdictions, possibly, and what precipitated that, where we have more advanced practices in certain jurisdictions than others?
Sure. I mean, my experience is mostly in emerging markets, but of course, I follow what's happening in the EU. Mainly because EU has been a leader in this area. It continues to be a leader in this area. while the US and the emerging markets are following the developments in the EU. And what we're seeing in the EU is really a momentum gaining pace recently around a number of things. One, around regulation, two, around classification of things and trying to create some kind of standardization. EU taxonomy, which I'm sure you're well aware of, is one area where the EU is really trying to classify what activities are considered sustainable and what activities aren't, and then a whole regulation around that, trying to really shift to allocate finance towards companies that are coming up with sustainable solutions, that are coming up with positive impact solutions. So we are really seeing the EU leading the way in this area. Now, the US, I think, is really at early stages of this journey compared to the EU, both in terms of how the governments are looking at it, but also from our experience, how investors, corporates are looking at it too. And that may partly be due to the fact that, you know, for a number of years until recently, the political leadership in the US was not really too focused in this area. But with the change of leadership in the US, I think we are going to see the US take some very important steps. And behind this is coming the emerging markets, which is where my expertise is, which is where I spend my time. And within emerging markets, it's not really a homogeneous region. I mean, emerging markets is a huge geography, and you see very, very different levels of understanding and approach towards sustainable investing, ESG, and impact in general. I think you can see some companies that are really well ahead of the pack in terms of their understanding and in terms of their practices, and you can find them in many markets. But overall, for example, Asia, which is where we do a lot of our investments, I would say maybe 60% of our fund is invested in Asia. It's a market that's been a little bit behind on issues regarding ESG, but we've been seeing a lot of progress recently. It's mainly top-down driven. It's mainly coming from governments. As more and more governments in the region announce net zero targets, or move ahead with regulation that are aimed to supporting the middle class in their countries, like the kind of things that we're seeing in China. The more that is happening, the more companies are taking that into account. But again, for example, in terms of investors' interest in this area or corporates' interest in this area, it's nowhere near Europe at the moment. But the change of the direction of travel is definitely on the right side. We're seeing a lot of progress in emerging markets.
That's very encouraging, and I think the case could be made that where we're seeing the biggest need for impact and to do impact at scale and move quickly probably is in emerging markets. So if we do a stock take of, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is really where we're seeing the many deficiencies and the things we need to get some level of an equitable, structure, society, and the planet, many of those deficits actually exist in those emerging markets. So I think that's an exceptionally encouraging thing to see. Aaron, let me turn to you very quickly to ask your perspective on the trends that you're seeing. I know you said that you're sort of early stage in looking at impact and you're most steeped in ESG, but that in itself has had quite a step change in the trends we're seeing recently. So if you could share with us some from your perspective as well.
Yeah, so as an academic, it's difficult to fight a battle where I can't show empirical evidence, right? And the issue with impact investing and doing academic research is that who decides what is good impact or not? That's incredibly difficult, right? So that's why my academic research, is focused on ESG, but that's not to say impact is not important, right? If we agree on this definition. This trend is very interesting, right? Because EU, defined EU taxonomy, and again, right, who is to define, people could ask who is EU to define it, but then people could also say that there needs to be a regular sort of regulators overarching framework, right, in helping this, right? So something that we have to think about, at least in terms of materiality, and I'll sort of elaborate more, is that my paper, Corporate Sustainability, First Evidence on Materiality, is effectively one of the first papers to show a tight sort of empirical result on ESG's financial materiality, right? But we used a SASB classification to define ESG's materiality. But at the end of the day, materiality of an ESG investment should not only vary at the industry level, but it should also vary firm and time level, right? It's just that we don't have a way to measure that very tightly, right? So I think in that sense, having an overarching regulatory framework is great. It is true that US is following, but I think at least sort of from an American perspective, it's very important to think about what is the purpose of a firm, right? And it's at the end of the day, even stocks in the EU are listed, right? And they're supposed to return value to shareholders, right? And if you don't have a company that's returning value to shareholders, and if that doesn't exist, then how can you return value to stakeholders, right? So if we think about this particular framework, like I've mentioned in my previous answer to your question, that sort of uncovering that link is becoming very, very important in the States. And I believe that it'll be important as IFRS has embraced SASB and Value Reporting Foundation's framework in that process. So there's no doubt that it's going to go internationally. And I think American asset managers and asset owners have started to realize this fuzziness of ESG. We ask people in the room what ESG is, and people will have different definitions as to what ESG is, right? But that should be the case because ESG by itself is subjective, right? So having this sort of overarching transparency, which I think the American regulators are moving alongside of the EU, will create a lot of solid basis for different investors with different investment theses to make different investment decisions and uncover value. So it's very exciting area for all of us, right? And also an exciting area for an accounting academic like myself, who's in the business of accounting for these things. And I believe that as we start small, we started, back in the days with CSR or even before the SRI. We're now at ESG, and who knows? We may go to impact, and the pie will grow.
So it is an exciting kind of transition, I think, that we're sitting in, Aaron, and interesting to see the interjurisdictional differences and the levels of advancement. But I want to quickly sort of ask you a little bit about fiduciary responsibility, and where does that sit? And look at that in this whole question of the trade-off between returns and impact, or in the ESG lens, just saying when we're delivering our primary responsibility, if you're looking at shareholder primacy, which is shareholders versus stakeholders at large. So can you give us a view, and I know that is more US-centric, on the notion of fiduciary responsibility and where that interplay is then with this discussion?
So this is a very difficult question, right? Because fiduciary duty is a very theoretical concept. And let's say you generate 8% return and the market generated 7%, and you did your DD or due diligence, is that really your full fiduciary duty? There's no sort of counterfactual for this, right? So that's what creates a lot of issues related to ESG investing. For example, greenwashing claims, right? There are a lot of whistleblowing, right? So how much credit do we give? How do we monitor as asset managers, from an asset allocator or a government perspective, right? Because at the end of the day, most of our pension money is being used to be invested in these ESG funds and whatnot, right? So it's a very difficult area to think about, this fiduciary duty, to be honest. But I think what we need is that we need to create these checks and balances to create an environment for fiduciary duty to be fulfilled at the end of the day, right? And I think, it's not only the academics or regulators or practitioners, a lot of people and stakeholders are thinking about this issue together, right? So I'm very excited to see, and I'm only a very small part of this movement for sure, so.
Oh, there we go. I hadn't unmuted myself. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. So, useful reflections from the US, and also the kind of, I guess, the slightly nebulous nature of the notion of fiduciary responsibility, yet it is still quite an important and pivotal concept in how we actually consider any of these things. I want to talk to you a little bit, Eli. You have already touched on it as an introduction a little bit, but perhaps to take us a little bit deeper on how is impact investing in emerging markets different than in developed markets. And you've given us a little bit of an introduction to this, but I think the work that you're doing that can look at both those markets is particularly interesting because some of the challenges I highlighted earlier about where the need is, right, to actually achieve those tangible differences in the real economy and to people and society. So could you maybe give us a little bit more insight about that, the difference between how impact is possibly considered in a developed market and then in an emerging market?
Sure. Shamila, I'll do that. But just before I do that, I just want to say two things because Aaron touched upon these points and I think they were really, really important. And I just want to say what we do around that. One thing Aaron said, is about like what is good ESG, what is sustainable, what is not, who decides these things. And that's absolutely, it really goes to the core of what we do. And I just want to give an example in terms of how we do it. For example, in our case, our framework for deciding what is sustainable or not is to use the UN SDGs, so UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we take that as a generally globally agreed framework to decide what is sustainable and what is not. So we can go through those goals and all the sub goals that are associated with them to decide whether a company's product is directly linked to it or not. So that's one way of doing that. And the second, again, super important thing that Aaron mentioned was about what's the purpose of a corporation. And it's shareholder value maximization. So how is ESG? How do we integrate ESG into that view? And it's absolutely true that view, Friedman's view of shareholder value maximization is really what has driven our view of what the purpose of a corporation is for many decades. But I think for the interest of all the webinar attendees, it would be very interesting to familiarize themselves with the works of people like Oliver Hart, who is a Nobel Prize recipient at Harvard, who's done a lot of work about shareholder welfare maximization. And it's all about maybe the purpose of a corporation is not just to maximize shareholder value, but shareholder welfare. And it's simply that, we're all, we are investors in these companies, through our investment plans or pension plans. And then we also have different roles in our lives. We're parents and we're individuals. And we want, on the one hand, of course, we want to get the maximum return from our investments, but at the same time, we want our kids to be living in a clean environment. We don't want them to breathe polluted air. Now, these they do not have to conflict with each other. The fact that we want great returns from our investors doesn't mean that we have to accept that our kids live in a polluted environment. There's a good combination of that, and that's welfare maximization. And there's a lot of great academic work around that. And I think that would be very useful to give a context to impact investing and ESG in general. Now, going back to your question about EM versus DM, I think one area is what you touched upon earlier. Some needs in EM are more acute, they're more important, they're more urgent. For example, when we are investing in developed markets, we're less worried about access to clean water. or access to decent healthcare, access to affordable, good quality education or nutrition. Those are a bit, those are problems that have been more or less solved in developed markets. Whereas in emerging markets, these are all areas that are in need of investing. So that's one thing that makes impact investing different in EM, that we have to focus in these areas that are already solved in DM. A company that's providing clean water is not seen as an impact company in Europe, but it can be a positive impact company in emerging markets. So that's one thing. The other thing that's interesting about EM is that even though in some aspects, emerging markets are behind developed markets, in some other areas like renewable energy, for example, or electric vehicle production, battery production, emerging market countries are actually leading. Some of the biggest, largest, lowest cost producers of renewable energy, solar, wind, or electric vehicles and batteries are located in emerging markets. So we also support these companies, and this is a very, very important big area of investing for us. And finally, one thing that's different is corporate's approach to ESG. That is, in general, not always, but in general, behind developed markets. And this is where we see our role as fund managers to guide and support these companies towards better ESG practices. And I think there's a lot we can do as emerging market investors to encourage companies to adopt better ESG practices. So I'd say those are the main big differences between EM and DM.
Thank you very much, Eli. Very enlightening, I think, there, and also making the clear distinction about how, I think, again, there's a spectrum, right? Depending on where in the world you are, about what really is impactful here might not be somewhere else, but and you need to really apply a mind. So I think for me, a key takeout there is how context matters, and that is really necessary for investors to apply their mind to the context in that country, and there just doesn't seem to be a general one-size-fits-all approach to this. So there's a level of due diligence that one needs to do, and application of really a reasonableness principle of what matters in which jurisdiction. And so impact will differ based on that, and using contextualization as your basis. I think, if I'm not misquoting you, missummarizing what you're getting at with your great input. Thank you, Eli. Aaron, on your side, I mean, this issue of trade-off, right? At which point do you say, well, I'm willing to look at impact versus return? Eli sketched for us earlier on that it's not a trade-off necessarily. It has to be financially viable. But is there in your mind a level of trade-off, if at all? And, do I have to sacrifice return for positive impact possibly? And within that context, if you could share some thoughts with us.
So, again, I think, I'll limit myself to ESG, because I think we have a little bit of a different definition as to what ESG and impact is. I don't think we're even there about talking about the trade-offs or not, to be honest. I think we're in the process of uncovering this non-financial information and debating as to how much it is financially material, and, how much sort of can we uncover, right? So in that sense, I think, this sort of, because trade-off, we will never know. No one has the answer to that, right? I mean, if someone had the answer to that's $1 billion or $1 trillion question, right? Especially given how much money is, signed the UNPRI in the recent 2021 and et cetera, right? So that's very difficult, but I think we're still in this early stage of defining ESG, uncovering the link between shareholder value, and trying to get this buy-in from people, especially the issuers, that they are using firm resources to, install filters to reduce greenhouse gas, or, prepare this ESG disclosure, or, having plans to, ensure the employee welfare, et cetera. So I think we're getting there, but not yet quite there to have that, at least I don't have that insight, to that debate.
Yeah. And any reflections on what Eli's talked about in terms of looking at the move from a shareholder primacy to kind of a shareholder stakeholder welfare perspective? Just your thoughts around that in your jurisdiction. How advanced are those thoughts and what does that look like for you?
So again, I'm an accounting academic and I'm in the business of quantifying accounting.
We're making your life difficult, Aaron.
And I agree fully with what Eli is saying at the conceptual level, but I think it's very, very difficult. What is shareholder welfare, right? How do we measure that? We're having trouble measuring shareholder return and having this, whether the managers are fulfilling their fiduciary duty or not. So I think having that discussion is very difficult. So let's say that, for example, EU is defining ESG and impact investors defining their scope of impact investment. Given the limited knowledge that we have, how do we know that is fully maximizing shareholder welfare, if not stakeholder welfare, right? So I think it depends on a very sort of specific clientele, so you speak, right? Who allocates money to that? You need to get that buy-in, and it depends on sort of who the client is at the end of the day. And I think the initiatives are great. I've sort of, you've been in the industry for some time as well. I've seen this SRI, CSR movement when I was in the industry trading stock and worked as a research analyst, and we sort of got to ESG. So, again, I have no doubts that we'll get there, but just trying to make baby steps, right? To quantify things, define things, work with, stakeholders, practitioners, regulators. And it's very insightful for me interacting, but, these are pretty difficult, answers, right? Or questions to have a good answer to as an academic.
Well, Aaron, you've been a great sport. We took an accounting professor and we put him on the spot and we asked you difficult questions, and you've really been a great sport. So we appreciate that. We've just got a few minutes left in hand. So I'd like to ask you for some parting shots. And, I'm going to ask you to gaze into your little crystal ball and tell me what you think the next 5 years is going to look like in this area. And, you've touched already, Aaron, I'll start with you and then I'll move to Eli. You've already mentioned some of the developments like the IFRS Foundation, looking at, setting up a sustainability standards board, embracing SASB into that. Just your quick 30-second view on what you think the next 5 years are going to look like, or alternatively, what you would like for it to look like.
Yeah, so thank you. As an accounting academic, again, I'll touch on disclosure and transparency a little bit more. So currently we're in the stage where different ESG data vendors and information providers are using different information, right? And you have institutional investors saying that, hey, this is so confusing, it's very difficult, we don't know how to make sense of ESG. Some years ago, when I used to work in finance, when I called institutional investors, my client investors, that's not the response that I got, right? Because they were like, oh, Wall Street analysts, how do you distinguish between each other? Their EPS forecast is identical. So against this backdrop, right, we need to think about how to aid investors to make decisions regarding impact or ESG or sustainability related information. And what I envision is that some type of regulation would provide effectively all menu of disclosures on ESG or broad sustainability topics. And investors can tap into it and see the actual disclosure of the firm. Mm-hmm. And that will shape how and serve as the first building block to shape their investment decision. That's what I'm hoping for, because there will be less sort of judgments and subjectivity. And also investors could use their own thesis as to what impact is, sustainability is, or ESG is, and then try to uncover value. And I think the market will be much more sort of better off with disclosure, though it is costly for firms.
Okay, so the professor is going for disclosure, regulation, and we're looking at decision useful information and subjective information. Okay, Aaron, we will regroup in 5 years and see how your wishes come true or not. Eli, can I end with you with your parting shots and thoughts on what you think 5 years are going to look like, or what would you like to look like?
Well, actually, I think the things that Aaron touched upon are really the most important things. And I think over the next 5 years, from a fund manager's point of view, I would love to have more standardization, more measurable impact, more a clearly defined regulation around these issues. I also think there's going to be a an explosion of alternative data around how to measure companies' ESG performances on E, S, and G, on all those metrics. I think together with the help of technology, we really are going to have a massive change in the data landscape around how to measure these things. And I am also hoping that there's going to be a wider discussion about the issue we touched upon earlier about what the role of a corporation is. Because I think in order, that goes beyond the ESG argument, beyond the sustainability argument. It's really more about the role of capitalism, because I think we all agree that capitalism has done a great job in providing us some material goods, but it's done not such a great job in terms of its impact on the environment, its social impact, and so on. And I think in the core of that debate lies the role of corporation. And if we are going to move to a more sustainable economic model, then the role of corporation really needs to be redefined. And I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see more and more discussion around that issue.
I think more and more discussion, but absolutely, hopefully more clarity, so I couldn't agree more with that. Thank you very much to both of you for those really thought-provoking inputs today and for sharing your wisdom so honestly and openly with us. Very grateful for that. And I think it's encouraging to see how far we've come, but also a stark realization of how far we still need to go. So Eli, I'm hoping that definition of the corporation and what it really needs to do is going to be changing in the next few years rapidly to allow us to meet the goals we need to meet ultimately for sustainable development, because the reality is we actually don't have that time. We're ticking against planetary boundaries, we're working against societal inequalities that really don't have time to be fixed. So let's hope that we all work together to move this debate quickly, and that in fact impact investing is going to play a big role in getting us there. Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you very much, Eli, for your time today, and all our listeners. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.